When it comes to organized crime in the US, we often find ourselves transported back to the 20th century. Since the 2000s, most people believe that gang activity has been on the decline. The reasons are clear: the development of surveillance and wiretapping systems, changing values, improving quality of life, new opportunities for earning money. If you're one of those who thought so, let me turn your world upside down a little, because the characters in this video have calmly committed crimes in the age of social media. But how did it happen that in the 2010s, a group of young men committed dozens of murders in Baltimore and remained uncaptured? Why Baltimore specifically? And how did a criminal gang become social media stars? We'll explore this and much more in this video. Meet the Trained to Go gang and their leader, Montana Barronette, on the other side of the law. Before you continue watching, I'd like to ask for your financial support of the channel. At the link in the description, you can find my store-branded merch with exclusive prints designed by me. If you have the opportunity and you like something, please buy it so you can help the channel to develop. Thank you in advance and enjoy your viewing. Before introducing you to the subjects of today's video, let's take a brief look at history, as this will answer many questions that may arise as the story unfolds. Today, we're interested in Sandtown, Winchester, a neighborhood in Baltimore located in the state of Maryland. At the time when the protagonists of this video were born, in the early 2000s, Sandtown was a dark spot against the backdrop of the city's glittering downtown. While tourists admired the beauty of the new buildings in the heart of Baltimore, Sandtown consisted of dilapidated houses with peeling walls, many of which were covered with lead paint, a harmful substance that caused local children to develop diseases. It was dirty and many residences were empty. While the Maryland Science Center was booming in the city center, most children here did not even finish school, leaving to earn a living in drug dealing. Murder was a daily occurrence, and the streets were always divided between gangs. But how did this happen? Let's start with the fact that even before the abolition of slavery in the United States, Baltimore had the highest number of free black residents. In 1860, of the approximately 18,000 African Americans in the city, 92% were free. However, there was no question of equal rights with white people at that time. Black residents of Baltimore were not allowed to vote, invest, or take out loans. State laws allowed free black people who committed even minor crimes to be sold into slavery, with guilt proven in court trials where only white citizens were allowed to testify, many of which were biased against the accused. In general, the Maryland government was opposed to the rapid growth of the black population and resorted to various tricks to keep it down. For example, in 1831, a law was passed stating that free black people entering Maryland could only stay there for 10 days. Surrounded by the open hostility of their white neighbors, Baltimore's black residents adapted to living in closed communities and began to create their own isolated culture. This was the first step toward the Sandtown we know today. Let's fast forward to 1865. The Civil War is coming to an end. The Union is victorious over the Confederacy, and slavery is abolished throughout the country. Maryland was no exception. However, for a long time after the end of the Civil War, racist sentiments persisted in the state, and the oppression of black people did not stop, but became more veiled. Black people could come to the city, but they were settled in unfavorable areas where living conditions, school education, and medical care left much to be desired. Most promising careers were inaccessible to black people, and only low-paying and less attractive jobs remained open to them. As a result, poverty, disease, and crime quickly flourished in the areas where black people settled, which was exactly what the authorities wanted, so they could point to all this and say, just look what happens to neighborhoods when these people move in. But despite this, there were black citizens who managed to break through the barriers and build businesses serving their closed communities. In 1910, several wealthy black people even attempted to buy homes in white neighborhoods, and then Baltimore hastily passed a law prohibiting this. It took 7 years before the Appellate Court of Maryland overturned it. Not because the law was clearly discriminatory against black people, but because of its sloppy wording, which accidentally restricted some white citizens from buying property. In Baltimore, strict segregation into neighborhoods for only African Americans or whites persisted for a very long time. One of the most telling reflections of the racism of the time was Fulton Avenue, divided into two opposing worlds. The buildings on the east side, where black people lived, were crowded tenements, with outhouses on the street, while the west side of the avenue, which belonged to white people, was prosperous and lined with stately private homes with running water and neatly trimmed lawns. The displaced black residents continued to fight for their existence, and at one point, their persistence even began to break down the system. By the 1930s, Sandtown and the adjacent neighborhood of Uptown had flourished and become homes to a prosperous black middle class. Here, families had decent homes, cars, and a lively and sophisticated nightlife, with restaurants, jazz clubs, bars, and theaters featuring prominent black artists. It seemed like a long-awaited beginning of a new era, but then came World War II, followed by a recession. Several factors coincided. After World War II, American industry migrated to the southern and western states with cheaper labor and a favorable climate, and some production was moved abroad altogether. At the same time, the U.S. underwent a transition from a manufacturing economy to a service economy. These factors led to the closure of many factories and, as a result, job losses. The already dire situation was exacerbated by urban decay, the so-called white flight, the exodus of the white population to the suburbs, and desolation. Housing prices plummeted, and once bustling neighborhoods became a wasteland of dilapidated houses and ruins. Sandtown, Winchester, which had previously been an example of the triumph of labor over discrimination, became a model of urban decay. On the contrary, the suburbs where white citizens moved flourished. Over time, all the life and functions of Baltimore moved there. And yes, racial zoning remained in place. In 1972, real estate agents were required to report to the police every black person who was planning to buy a home in the wrong neighborhood. There was no formal ban on African Americans buying properties, but being called in for questioning and talking to hostile white neighbors effectively discouraged the practice. The suburbs of Baltimore remained predominantly white, and in the 70s, this was described as a white noose, strangling the city socially and economically. But as the years passed, Baltimore's black population continued to grow, and the old order was replaced by a new one. By 1990, people of color made up 90% of the city's voters, and Baltimore's first black mayor was in office. A slow process of integration was underway. White people were lured back to the city, though more for entertainment than for living. In the 1980s and 1990s, the so-called Inner Harbor Renaissance began. Empty buildings in the city center were demolished and replaced with shopping malls, office towers, hotels, restaurants, the Maryland Science Center, 2 giant sports stadiums. In short, they made it look beautiful. You may be thinking, great, so the rundown neighborhoods like Sandtown got something too. But no, both the Baltimore government and journalists simply ignored these neighborhoods. After fixing up the empty downtown, the reformers started basking in the glory. Baltimore was recognized as a global model of urban renewal, and enthusiastic tourists flocked here. No one even mentioned Sandtown, until reporter David Simon came on the scene. Simon was not satisfied with this collective ignorance of the problems in the old urban ghettos, and he decided to open the public's eyes. First, Simon wrote the book Homicide: A Year on the Killing Streets, which was later adapted into the TV series Homicide: Life on the Street. Then, in collaboration with former city detective Edward Burns, he published the book The Corner: A Year in the Life of an Inner-City Neighborhood, which formed the basis for the TV show The Wire. Simon then dealt a decisive blow to the reputation of Baltimore's urban renewal program. Collaborating with Burns and a team of talented writers, actors, and directors, he created the masterpiece The Wire, an authentic TV series that aired from 2002 to 2008. The shockingly realistic show depicted a city rife with drugs, murder, and corruption. Viewers were stunned. The beauty of the rebuilt Baltimore was exposed as a sham, and criticism poured in. If the wealthy white people behind the redevelopment could work such magic on the city center, why didn't they lift up neighborhoods like Sandtown? Why build attractions for tourists and sports fans when black people need basic things like affordable housing, better schools, and good jobs? The reformers had no answer. But the politicians responsible for Baltimore's Renaissance took up the challenge. It seemed that if they could turn a trash-strewn downtown into a tourist destination, surely they could change the fortunes of one of the city's black neighborhoods. But they couldn't. With the support of the mayor and an established group of municipal and business leaders, more than $130 million were poured into Sandtown, Winchester over the next decade. It seems like a lot of money, but the disgraced reformers were highly motivated to do a good job. So what went wrong? Of course, there were some successes. There were people who were helped by special programs to get back on their feet, though these lucky ones immediately left Sandtown for more favorable places, leaving behind another abandoned house. And in 2008, the financial crisis reduced the already small number of these lucky few even further. However, most of Sandtown's residents were too old, young, unskilled, or unmotivated to seize unfamiliar opportunities, and so they stayed where they were. As a result, instead of becoming a model of urban renewal, Sandtown became a symbol of its futility. The consequences of centuries of racial segregation and poverty proved more difficult to reverse than anyone could have imagined. And so, at the beginning of the story of Montana Barronette and the Train to Go Gang, or TTG for short, we see the following picture of Sandtown: drugs, murder, hopelessness. And it would seem that Montana's fate was a standard story about a guy who just followed the law of the streets. Except that Montana didn't just follow the law of the streets. But let's take it one step at a time. Montana Malik Barronette was born in 1995. His father, Delroy, was arrested several times in the 90s, served time in prison, and was deported to Jamaica when Montana was only 4 years old. His mother, Annette, also had problems with the law and involved her children in drug dealing, teaching them to live by street rules. Montana, or Tana as everyone called him, had a younger sister, Sahantana, and an older brother and sister, Terrell and Shanika, whom Annette had with another man. The fathers were not involved in the children's lives, and the children were caught between two fires, their mother and their grandmother Dolores. Annette and Dolores were polar opposites. The former was promiscuous, while the latter was devout and strict. Dolores attended church and felt responsible for Annette's children, believing that they should not suffer for their parents' sins. She tried to instill Christian values in her grandkids and often took them to church with her, but the ridicule of their peers and their mother's contrasting upbringing ruined Dolores' plans. In his early childhood, Montana, who was not yet immersed in street life, said he wanted to be a police officer when he grew up. But as we already know, fate had a completely different scenario in store for him. Montana became an errand boy for drug dealers. Soon, he started selling drugs himself and committing more serious crimes. He was arrested for car theft at the age of 9, even though at that point Montana was barely tall enough to see over the steering wheel. Over time, Tana and his stepbrother Terrell began working for a local heroin dealer, Devon Robinson, selling a product called Get Right, which was heroin mixed with various substances. After working as runners delivering the goods to customers, the brothers, still teenagers, started their own business. The guys started selling their product under the name Get Right, but after Robinson was killed, they changed the name to True Bomb. In addition to heroin, they sold fentanyl, cocaine, and marijuana, as well as Percocet, Xanax, and other pills. They quickly became rich, becoming well-known members of the street subculture with their own style, lingo, and music. The brothers didn't have a permanent place to live, but they didn't see that as a problem. They were fine with not having a permanent address. After running away from their religious grandmother, Tana and Rel, as Terrell was called, felt free. Drug dealing was the only area where they, as black children from a poor family and a disadvantaged neighborhood, had an advantage, as they entered the criminal game when most children were going to bed at their parents' behest. Tana and Rel used drugs, drank, and became sexually active at an early age, often with several girls at once. Tana became the father of a son and a daughter from different women, and Rel became the father of 3 daughters. In general, Montana Barronette lived like most children in his situation. However, something set him apart. Those around him noticed that Tana was very intelligent. He was also pleasant, friendly, even a little silly, and loved to sing and give compliments. While it was enough for Rel to simply have money, Tana had some ambition. Even as his earnings and reputation on the street grew, Tana continued to attend Edmondson Westside High School, although most of his friends and relatives had long since dropped out. He played football and basketball and did well enough in school to graduate in 2013, the first in his family to do so. He told his sister Shanika that he intended to break the vicious cycle of poverty and despair that engulfed their family, and that he wanted to be an example to other kids, to show them, in his words, that they don't have to be street guys. Montana enrolled in a state farm program that trained big rig drivers so that he would have another option if necessary, to become a worker, as those who earned an honest living were called in Sandtown. Workers were treated with a mixture of pity and respect. One could admire the integrity of those who avoided the criminal game, but for most, it led only to low-paying, back-breaking work and shattered hopes. Too many obstacles stood in the way of greater legitimate success. In 2015, when Tana turned 20, Harvard University researchers ranked 100 American cities according to how easy it was for children born into poverty to escape it. Baltimore came in last. Nevertheless, Tana did not give up on this chance. However, he was not destined to take advantage of it. Soon, his name became notorious on the streets of Sandtown, and he ceased to be just a drug dealer. We don't know exactly when Montana Barronette committed his first murder, but we can talk about the cases where his involvement has been confirmed. Montana's first proven murder took place on May 3, 2014. The victim was a barber named Alfonso Williams. The seemingly insignificant motive for the crime made the situation even more dire. Montana was walking past a group of young people from the neighborhood, including Leandra and Alfonso Williams, their stepsister Ellis Bridges, and Alfonso's friend, Daniel Purdy, known by the nickname Yo Gotti. Barronette made a lewd joke about the sisters, and Alfonso stood up for them. But the altercation ended peacefully, and Williams even invited Montana to watch a fight later. However, when it got dark and Alfonso, Gotti, and Leandra went out onto the porch to wait for a pizza, Montana emerged from the alleyway, hooded and armed with a gun. Alfonso was shot 9 times in the chest, arms, and neck. The alcohol in his blood complicated the doctor's efforts to stop the bleeding, and Alfonso died on the operating table. Many people saw the shooter, but only the frightened sisters decided to cooperate with the police. They gave the name of the suspect, not understanding the silence of the others, including Gotti, who was nearby. Soon, the reason became clear. Montana Barronette was known for his violent reputation. After Alfonso Williams' sister identified Tana as the suspect, he was taken in for questioning. During interrogation by Detective Josh Fuller, Tana expressed surprise that he was suspected of murder. He admitted that there had been a minor altercation between him and the victim earlier that evening, but insisted he had no involvement in the crime that night. He claimed that he had spent time with a woman at the Sheraton Hotel in the city center, but was unable to provide details about the registration or the name used for identification. Despite the woman's confirmation of his story, hotel records and surveillance cameras did not corroborate his alibi. However, due to lack of evidence, the prosecutor was unable to press charges. The sisters were entirely certain about identifying Tana, and Yo Gotti's testimony was questionable. The case was suspended. But what happened? What was Tana's motive? After all, the murder of Alfonso Williams seems completely senseless. Shooting a man 9 times because of a brief conversation that ended in a truce is a really strange decision, especially considering that the victim and the killer hardly knew each other, and several hours passed since the conversation with Alfonso, meaning that the shooting was not an impulse but a deliberate decision. A year before Tana was born, sociologist Elijah Anderson analyzed the factors influencing young black men in secluded ghettos in his essay, Code of the Street. At the heart of the street code is the concept of respect, which must be constantly earned and defended. In street culture, showing disrespect can have serious consequences, including physical confrontation. People who live by this code are especially sensitive to any signs of disrespect. Tana's reaction to Williams' remark follows this logic. You may ask why he killed him instead of, say, just beating him up. Probably, in Tana's society, winning a fight was not a common or respected way to defend one's reputation. In Sandtown, tough guys had to be the ones who were always ready to shoot. The very next day after this incident, on May 4th, instead of lying low and not attracting unnecessary attention, Montana openly opposed a guy who had lots of authority in Sandtown. The thing is, before Montana and his friends took over Sandtown Winchester, the local king was a drug dealer named Ponyhead. His real name was Jan Gray, but almost no one called him that. Ponyhead sold drugs, just like his father before he was killed. He started his career in the criminal underworld while still in elementary school, running errands for a gang. Gradually, Pony rose through the ranks and came to control his own territory. His holdings stretched 2 blocks between Calhoun Street and Carrollton Avenue, north to Mosher Street, and south to Edmondson Avenue, bordering Harlem Park and Lafayette Square. This narrow rectangle was a lucrative drug market. Ponyhead oversaw the cutting, packaging, and distribution of heroin-based Sweet Dreams in small glass vials with red caps, selling them for $1 a piece. Pony's Corners operated daily from 7 in the morning until 7 at night and brought in good money. Ponyhead had known Tana since he was a kid and treated him kindly. The fact that Tana and his stepbrother Rel were selling their goods on his turf didn't bother Ponyhead. Demand was huge. There were enough customers to go around, and Montana Barronette seemed like a harmless teenager to him. There was just one catch. Ponyhead expected Tana to pay him a percentage for working on his turf. But Tana had become so emboldened that he decided to oust Pony. His insolence became especially apparent in 2012 when Rel was arrested for drug trafficking, and Tana took sole control of their small team of drug dealers called Train to Go. They borrowed the name of their team from the rap song TTG, Train to Go, by Waka Flocka Flame. It all started with words. According to eyewitnesses, a conversation took place between Tana and Pony, during which the former said to the latter, "You're not the boss anymore." Ponyhead was, of course, shocked by such boldness, but he chalked it up to youth and didn't think much of Tana's words. A month later, when Pony was walking to the store, Tev, a member of the TTG crew, shot at him twice, but missed. This seemed suspicious to Ponyhead, but he again decided not to take any action, thinking that the teenager was just trying to prove how cool he was. For people who grew up in cities with a high standard of living, this may sound strange, but in Sandtown, shooting into the air near a person was, in some cases, something that could be dismissed. Tev didn't look threatening. He didn't dare to approach Ponyhead, which convinced him that the kid wouldn't dare shoot again. Ponyhead still refused to see the children who had grown up before his eyes as a serious threat. Over time, his opinion changed. A police officer he knew, Joe Landsman, let Ponyhead listen to a phone conversation between Tana and Rel, who was under arrest, where they clearly talked about getting rid of Ponyhead. And while a few years earlier he would have just laughed it off, at that moment Ponyhead was not amused. He knew for sure that Tana and Rel had already killed people, and he had heard that the brothers were making lists of those they planned to kill, sometimes hiring others to do it for them, and offering small rewards of up to $10,000. They seemed to care more about their reputation than money, seeking to become famous as the most brutal gangsters in Baltimore. In the end, Ponyhead decided he had earned his keep and backed down without a fight. It seemed that the experienced gangster realized that a showdown with wild young thugs could very well cost him his life, so Ponyhead's turf was officially taken over by TTG, who seized Sandtown and even renamed their own product Sweet Dreams. But how did a group of young people manage to oust an experienced and influential drug dealer without a fight? What did they have that made Ponyhead retreat? The answer lies in the influence of mass media. By the end of the 20th century, the image of the ghetto star had already spread throughout society, a very bold and very wealthy drug dealer spitting on all laws, making money from crime, and simply basking in luxury. For example, some 40 years before Montana's rise in Baltimore, a street thug named Maurice King, known as Peanut, rose to fame. Starting out selling heroin, he eventually took control of the entire drug trade in the city. At the height of his career, Peanut made a fortune. He spent it on luxury items, wore diamonds, furs, and tailor-made suits, bought a DeLorean despite not having a driver's license, flew on private jets to Sugar Ray Leonard's fights and Diana Ross concerts, smoked cigarettes from a diamond-studded cigarette holder. In short, he reached extraordinary heights and became famous in the media precisely because of his image. In the 21st century, people have more opportunities for self-expression. The internet has erased the boundaries of word of mouth and random news in local media. People always created their own legends, but with the advent of social media, everyone now has a global audience. Everyone became a star of their own making, although it wasn't easy to stand out in the general noise of self-promotion. The ghetto stars had their own approach. Blood still attracted attention. Thus, attention was added to the list of reasons that prompted Tana to enter the crime game. By the age of 19, he was known not only in Sandtown, but also in the select underground media culture that supported him. By the time he faced off against Ponyhead, Tana's reputation was already trending on online platforms. The shootouts on the streets of Baltimore had become a kind of sport. There were Instagram accounts detailing every shooting, posts sparking a flurry of comments urging people not to report the shooters, and speculating about the reasons behind the choice of victims. TTG members referred to murders reported on television or in newspapers as their highlights, a term coined by Tana, who used it on his Instagram when posting photos or videos showing weapons, money, and hints about a recent crime. The killings were counted like notches on a gun handle. In Sandtown, people became targets for revenge, turf wars, or suspected collaboration with the police. In such an environment, even rumors of a bounty on your head could lead to death. Of course, social media was filled with condemnation and regret about what was happening, about the horror of it all. There were calls to stop the killings, but there was also a dark chorus of approval. In this new digital world, reputations spread instantly, and Trained to Go worked hard on their personal brand. Many team members had Instagram accounts tagged TTG, where they posted photos of themselves in casinos or prestigious establishments in Los Angeles and Miami, flaunting wads of cash, pointing guns, and raising their middle fingers provocatively at the camera. The themes of these photos were consistent: gleeful defiance, enthusiastic violence, huge amounts of money, and above all, authenticity. There were no posers taking selfies. They were self-proclaimed OGs. Then came the videos. The first, Be With God, was posted on April 3, 2015. It was masterfully done, shot in black and white with superb cinematography and direction. It began in a cemetery and then transitioned to a clip from a real Baltimore TV news program. A reporter says, "This morning's murder is the 17th in Baltimore, in just the 17th day of the new year." And then a guy named Devonte Harrison, aka Young Go-Getter, or YGG Tay, raps and dances in the cemetery. Gradually, members of TTG appear in the clip, playing themselves, free and unprincipled gangsters. YGG Tay impressed Tana and his crew. He had high-quality production and financial backers. He brought Trained to Go to the world stage, presenting them as cool, bold, tough, and lavish, living by the harsh code of the criminal game. They weren't just anonymous extras dancing behind the singer, but real gangsters. Soon they appeared in another video, Day, where they bragged about risking their lives every day and contributing to the high murder rate in the neighborhood. The members of TTG grew up together, so to speak. They went to school together until they dropped out, played football and basketball together, sold and used drugs together, shared their earnings, weapons, girlfriends, and ultimately, their murders. Most of them had babies with different women in the neighborhood. They roamed the streets of their dilapidated little world and felt comfortable. After Rel was sentenced to 5 years in prison in 2012, Tana took the role of their leader. The core of the gang consisted of John Binky Harrison, Taurus Tash Tillman, Tevin Tev Haygood, Guy Fat Guy Coffee, Brandon Ali Wilson, Linton Broughton, aka Party Marty or just Marty, Antonio Bandit Addison, Brandon Man Bazemore, and Timothy Timrod Floyd. These guys, along with Rel and Tana, formed the core of the TTG, with dozens of other people revolving around them, brothers, cousins, and casual friends. There were also 2 older men on the fringes of the gang who played an important role, Roger Milk Taylor and Dennis Pulley, aka Denmo. They were the team's drug suppliers, had outside connections, and a wealth of experience. Both acted as mentors of sorts to Tana and Rel. It was this group of young men who would soon cause Baltimore to drown in blood, because only 2 months after the murder of Alfonso Williams on June 29, 2014, Terrell Jarrett, known as Hell Rel, was killed on Carey Street. Jarrett had once been close to YGG Tay, but made the mistake of losing a large sum of money and drugs belonging to the rapper. After a conflict with Tay, Hell Rel hit him, which proved to be a fatal mistake. A reward was offered for his murder, which was divided between Montana and Binky. 4 months later, 2 more local gangsters, James Blake and Ronald Langley, were killed. Their fatal mistake was attempting to kidnap Milk, who financed YGG Tay's career by working closely with major drug dealer Shango Owens. The kidnappers grabbed the wrong man. Not only in a figurative sense, Milk was definitely not someone you could safely kidnap, but also literally the wrong man. They captured Darius Singleton, Milk's friend, who had lent him his car. Realizing their mistake, Blake and Langley stripped their captive, took his money, and let him go. Upon learning of this, Milk and YGG Tay offered a reward for their deaths. Soon, Blake and Langley were shot, and once again, Tana and Binky were named as the alleged killers. Langley was later burned, which became a trademark of the TTG. His charred remains were found in November behind an elementary school in West Baltimore. The next victim was Brian Chase, aka Busy, another guy from Sandtown. His body was found in a small fenced-in yard, his face buried in dog excrement. Busy's mistake was to spread a rumor that there was a price on Binky's head. Maybe it was true, maybe it wasn't, but the rumor itself was extremely dangerous, as it could have made Binky a target. Busy was, of course, a loudmouth, but his words were taken seriously because he was in the know on the streets. Busy was a member of the Black Guerrilla Family, BGF, a well-respected prison organization that was planning to expand its influence beyond the prison walls and take control of the drug trade. The gang was a potential threat, as it had a solid reputation behind bars. Outside, the BGF was less formidable, but still dangerous enough to threaten local groups such as TTG. When Binky realized Busy's message, he had reason to be concerned and take urgent action. On January 4th, 2015, he and Tana spotted Busy on the sidewalk on Mosher Street. They got out of their Mercedes, caught up with Busy on foot, and shot him 14 times. One bullet hit him right in the throat, which could have been a simple coincidence or a warning to those who, like Busy, talked too much. Another murder organized by Train to Go took place on March 2nd, 2015. The reason was the bullying of a pimply 13-year-old named Tevin Haygood. Tev still looked young enough to be regularly humiliated by a tall man named Marquez Jones. Every time he saw Tev, Jones would take everything he found in his pockets. Then one day, Tev was hanging out on the sidewalk with Tana and other gang members. When they saw Jones coming out of Harlem Park Middle School, Tana gave Tev a gun and sent him to defend his honor. Tev approached Jones while he was talking to his friend and shot him several times. Jones died on the spot. By early 2015, Tana's name appeared in the files on each of the murders mentioned above, and Sandtown residents whispered his name to the police, but no one agreed to testify. Therefore, even when TTG openly boasted about their crimes on social media, homicide detectives were unable to gather enough evidence for the prosecutor. However, the growing popularity of Montana and his gang could not remain free from unpleasant consequences. In June 2015, he was the target of an assassination attempt. Tana was riding his motorcycle down the street when shots were fired at him. He narrowly escaped injury. Tana was convinced that the shooter was a friend of Lamont Randall, a member of the BGF who claimed his gang's territory. At first, Tana tried to settle the matter through conversation. He turned to Devon Robinson, also a member of the BGF, and Robinson agreed to meet with Randall to try and resolve the conflict. However, Robinson was soon arrested and the meeting did not take place. More shooting followed. On the evening of July 7th, Tana, Binky, Man, and another guy attacked Randall on the street. Randall was shot 17 times. 3 other people near him were also wounded. Investigating the murder scene, police found 53 shell casings scattered across the blood-stained sidewalk. Although violence and shootouts were not uncommon in Sandtown, Winchester, this triple murder attracted widespread attention in Baltimore. The murders were reported on television news and in the papers. Reports named the victims but said nothing about the killers. The city homicide department had no doubt who was responsible. 4 people were listed as suspects in the case: Antonio Addison, Bandit; Brandon Bazemore, Man; John Harrison, Binky; and Montana Barronette, Tana. None of them were arrested. 45 people were killed in Baltimore that month, but only this triple homicide attracted the attention of city authorities. The day after the shooting, a meeting was called to emphasize the need to deal with the TTG gang. Of course, authorities had long been aware of the numerous murders and the thriving drug trade in Sandtown. They were also aware of the Train to Go gang, whose bloodthirstiness could no longer be ignored. And of course, the city administration was not sitting on its hands and made attempts to change the situation. Initially, responsibility for what was happening was placed on the city police, who were supposed to have knowledge of the area, connections with local communities, and the ability to identify criminals. However, in Baltimore, the police themselves became part of the problem. A 2016 investigation by the Department of Justice revealed systematic corruption, racism, and abuse. Black residents were arrested significantly more than white residents. often without sufficient grounds. Police incompetence silenced people, and victims sought justice on their own, further exacerbating the situation. The Justice Department's investigation ended with an agreement on reforms to the city police under federal oversight. Although federal agents lacked the numbers and reach of local police, they had resources and tools unavailable even to well-funded local forces: advanced surveillance techniques, big data analysis, and experienced detectives and prosecutors. They could devote months or even years to a single case, provide protection and relocation funding for witnesses, and then hand the defendants over to the federal court, where jurors were selected from across the state, rather than just from local residents who distrusted the police and the justice system. Plus, the feds had a powerful weapon at their disposal to fight gangs: the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations, or RICO Act of 1970. Originally designed to prosecute the mafia and other large criminal syndicates whose leaders often evaded justice, RICO proved effective against any criminal enterprise. Although a small gang like TTG may not have been what the law's creators had in mind, it had the same characteristics as large syndicates. In most cases, state courts required separate trials for each defendant, but with RICO, prosecutors only had to prove the existence of a criminal organization, the defendant's membership in it, and that the crime served the interests of that organization. This allowed entire gangs to be tried at the same time. The use of RICO against the TTG may have seemed excessive, but by 2015, this gang had become serial killers. Extraordinary problems require extraordinary solutions. The work to catch TTG was carried out mainly by 3 detectives from the FBI's task force: Mark Neptune, Dan DeLorenzo, and Joe Landsman. The latter was a hereditary police officer in Sandtown, which allowed him to hire informants. Let's start from the beginning. To deal with TTG, Landsman and his colleagues planned to obtain a warrant to tap Tana's phone, as he was one of the key members of the gang. To obtain the warrant, they needed inside information about the gang, namely the phone numbers used for criminal activities. Considering that each gang member had 5 or 6 active phones, which they changed as often as disposable napkins, this was no easy task. This is where Landsman's connections came in handy. To start with, he found common ground with Guy Coffey, nicknamed Fat Guy, one of the TTG members who apparently had started working on his own over time. Landsman and Fat Guy had met back in 2006. Landsman arrested the then 15-year-old Coffey for looking out for police during a drug deal. Later, he arrested him again, this time as a drug dealer. Guy continued his criminal activities while serving his sentences. Returning to the streets in 2015, he immediately resumed his services. In July of that year, Landsman investigated the murder of a police informant. With no leads, he monitored the area using city cameras. He tried to understand the behavior of key figures, who they were in contact with, where they spent their time, and where they hid illegal substances. During his surveillance, he noticed a familiar, heavy-set figure. The fat man was dealing drugs again. Landsman immediately gave the order for his arrest. Once at the police station, Guy exchanged jokes with Landsman about his past bravado. Fat Guy claimed that he had grown wiser and complained about how impossible it was to escape the vicious circle of arrests and imprisonment. He claimed that he was tired of this life and that he had recently had a child and that selling drugs was his only means of earning a living. Landsman, who had the funds to pay informants, offered the man an alternative. Coffey turned out to be the perfect candidate for a confidential informant. Once he realized that he would be paid well for the information, there was no stopping him. His reputation on the streets and his connections with various gangs gave him unique access to intel. Fat Guy wasn't just acquainted with Tana and the other members of the TTG. They considered him one of their own, had grown up together, and trusted him. He was Sandtown's living database, and if he didn't know the answer right away, he could find it quickly and easily. And he knew all the gang's phone numbers. To obtain a court order, they needed to document at least 30 calls from Tana to one of his drug dealers. They also needed to obtain a photo of Tana using the target phone during one of these calls. At the end of November, while in a car with detectives, Guy placed an order with Tana by phone, and on November 24th, the deal took place. Guy bought 10 grams of heroin from Tana at a gas station, paying with money provided by the task force. It was their first controlled purchase. With the number Barronette used for this transaction, investigators could request records from the provider of all calls made from that device over the previous months, in theory for the last 18 months. but since TTG members' numbers were not stored for that long, the time frame was shorter. The 10 most popular numbers would indicate his closest associates. By comparing the data obtained from Fat Guy with their own records, they linked the numbers to names, Rel, Binky, Tash, and others, and mapped out the structure of the TTG. Next, they needed to prove that each of these targets' phones was used to sell drugs. This would allow them to obtain a warrant to wire their phones for a limited period, usually 10 days to 2 weeks. If there were no calls from Tana during that time, they had to start over and find a new active member. In short, it was a very tedious task. In addition to Fat Guy, Joe Landsman had 2 other informants. The first was Ponyhead, the drug dealer who Train to Go had driven out of his own territory, and the second was Ronnie Johnson, aka Raw. This guy was a member of the BGF prison gang, which we mentioned earlier in the story. After his release, Raw couldn't find a job because of his reputation, got involved in drug dealing, became addicted, and his whole life went downhill, where Landsman found him. Raw, like Fat Guy, was a frontman for TTG. Meanwhile, TTG's actions reinforced the detectives' arguments about the urgency of the situation. On November 8th, they killed David Moore, known as Day Day. Moore had previously killed Tana's friend, and when Tana was shown a recording of the incident, he assured his buddies, "I'll take care of it." And he did. Another murder was added to TTG's list on December 28th. This time, the victim was Dominic Harris, nicknamed Shotgun, who apparently had crossed paths with Barronette's gang. By the end of 2015, surveillance of TTG members and wiretapping of Tana and Rel's phone calls, which the feds had access to because Rel was calling from a prison phone, began to bear fruit. The first wire on Montana's phone was installed on Wednesday, January 20th, 2016. The Train to Go investigation required months of painstaking work by investigators, listening to phone calls which were often insufficient for charges because Tana and his associates used code words and replaced the names of drugs with other words, as well as working with informants and recording deals on camera. In 2016, the investigators' efforts paid off. Tana was arrested on the evening of Friday, August 19th. Tana responded to his arrest with laughter. "You treat me like John Dillinger," he said. At that point, the RICO charges were not yet ready, and Tana was arrested for the murder of Alfonso Williams, so he didn't worry too much and thought that by paying a good lawyer, he would get off scot-free. Over the next few months, the task force and city police found reasons to arrest almost all of Montana's gang members: Rel, Man, Marty, Timrod, Binky, Dinmo, Ollie, and Tash. Only Milk escaped immediate arrest, as his involvement in criminal activity was less obvious, and his detainment was pending RICO charges, but he too was arrested later. The TTG trial began more than 2 years after the arrests. 10 gang members and their associates, Tana, Rel, Binky, Milk, Tash, Dinmo, Man, Marty, Timrod, and Ollie were charged. Only 2 pleaded guilty, Man and Milk. The remaining 8 stood trial on charges of 10 murders committed as part of a large-scale drug trafficking case. The alleged crimes were committed over a period of 8 years. Interestingly, the murder of Alfonso Williams, the barber who was shot after an argument with Tana, was excluded because it was not directly related to the drug trade. Incidentally, before Montana Barronette appeared before the judge, he got a taste of freedom, albeit for a short time. After his arrest, Tana was held at the Baltimore City Detention Center, located east of downtown. He lived in dorm-like conditions with other inmates awaiting trial. Then, Tana's murder charge against Alfonso Williams was dropped when the task force finally filed a RICO lawsuit in late December. After that, he could no longer be legally detained by the state of Maryland. He was supposed to be transferred to a federal prison, but that part of the directive was overlooked. Tana was summoned to the release zone at the registration center on January 14, 2017, where he learned that he could return home. Tana decided that the danger had passed and did not even bother to move or go into hiding. He simply went back to street life. Then he was spotted by people who had been tearing their hair out for months trying to get him arrested. At first, these guys were shocked that all their efforts had almost been in vain, but then they quickly grabbed Tana and arrested him. Only a few days had passed, and when he was arrested again, Montana complained that he didn't have time to do anything. This time, Barronette was taken to a prison in the District of Columbia, and then transferred to a prison in Warsaw, Virginia, where he was to await trial. The trial lasted 24 days over 6 weeks, from September 18, 2018 to the last day of October. Brandon Ali Wilson received 25 years in prison despite being considered the least guilty. Linton Marty Broughton, Timothy Timrod Floyd, and Dennis Denmo Pulley were each sentenced to 30 years. Taurus Tash Tillman received a 25-year sentence. John Binky Harrison was sentenced to 2 life sentences. Rel received life plus 30 years. Montana, like Harrison, was sentenced to 2 life sentences. Although the TTG had been eliminated, contrary to all predictions, the situation in Sandtown did not improve. In fact, the murder rate actually increased. The demand for drugs did not go away, and other gangsters simply replaced trained to go. Tana is currently in a maximum security federal prison in Pollock, Louisiana. Except for a brief release in early 2017, he spent more than 6 years behind bars. In 2021, he was stabbed in a prison fight but survived. As of 2025, he is now 30 years old. He has almost no prospects for release.